Have you ever been in a room full of people yet felt completely invisible? That was Yumi Takahara's reality, a Japanese millionaire sitting quietly at a Cleveland charity gala. She wasn't noticed for her success, but judged for her silence, because she couldn't speak fluent English. Guests whispered, dismissed her, and moved on, never realizing who she truly was. But then, one unexpected voice cut through the noise, and in that moment, everything changed. The ballroom shimmered that night beneath golden chandeliers, each crystal strand catching the light and scattering it like diamonds across the polished tables. The scent of fresh roses floated in the air, mingling with the clinking of wine glasses and the soft hum of a live jazz band playing in the corner. Waiters weaved gracefully through the crowd with trays balanced high, while Cleveland's most influential guests gathered to celebrate wealth, disguised as generosity. The gala sparkled with designer gowns, sleek tuxedos, and conversations laced with charm yet empty of depth. To anyone watching, it was an evening of glamour and easy laughter. But not for Yumi Takahara. She sat at her assigned table near the center of the room, elegant and poised, every detail of her appearance polished with quiet precision. Her silk gown flowed like water, her posture straight, her face calm. Yet, despite her composure, she seemed set apart, as if she were a painting, hung on the wall, admired from a distance but never approached with true intent. Guests turned toward her with fleeting smiles, polite nods, and curious glances, then quickly drifted back into the safe comfort of familiar conversation. When someone did attempt to engage, the exchange was painfully brief. "Lovely evening, isn't it?" one man said with a forced brightness, his champagne flute tilting as he waited. Yumi returned the smile, nodded, and searched for words. Her English came out slow, halting, fragile. The man gave a small laugh that didn't reach his eyes and excused himself almost immediately. Another woman leaned over with an empty compliment about Yumi's gown, but when Yumi's answer stumbled, the woman turned back to gossiping with her friends. Each interaction ended the same way, short, uncomfortable, unfinished. Yumi's silence was not arrogance. It was effort. Behind her graceful exterior, her mind spun tirelessly, reaching for words that would not come, rehearsing phrases that never sounded right once spoken. The barrier of language stood tall and unforgiving, turning every attempt into an awkward pause. She could feel it in the tightening of her chest, the shallow breath she drew before each reply, the heat that rose faintly to her cheeks when conversations collapsed. Around her, the laughter of others only made the quiet at her table sharper. It was as if the entire room had decided she belonged behind an invisible wall, seen, acknowledged, yet excluded. Whispers reached her ears, not sharp enough to catch every word, but enough to carry their tone. Light amusement, casual dismissal, curiosity laced with condescension. She lowered her gaze to her hands folded neatly in her lap, the smile never leaving her lips, though inside she carried the heavy ache of being misunderstood. From across the room, Danielle noticed. She was a waitress that night, her black uniform, blending her into the shadows, her tray balanced as she moved between tables with practiced grace. But her eyes were sharper than most. While others focused on their own reflections in the polished silverware, Danielle saw Yumi, the way she sat so still, the way her attempts at conversation were met with gentle but firm dismissal, the way her silence grew heavier with each passing moment. She watched as one guest leaned too close, speaking slowly as though Yumi were a child, over-enunciating words with an indulgent smile. Yumi nodded politely, murmured a response, and the guest excused himself with relief, leaving her once again in the quiet center of the noise. Danielle's grip on her tray tightened. She knew that look, that invisible loneliness, because she had worn it herself once. The kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being surrounded by people who have already decided not to see you. As the night went on, the gap widened. The conversations at Yumi's table grew livelier, spilling over with laughter and stories, but they never included her. It was as though a circle had formed, and she sat just outside its edge, present but excluded. The others barely noticed. They raised glasses, exchanged glances, laughed at jokes that Yumi could not catch, and allowed her presence to fade into a decorative silence. Yumi remained composed, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. But beneath the calm exterior, her thoughts swirled. She wondered if they saw her at all, or if she was nothing more than a seat filled, a name on a guest list, a figurehead to applaud when donations were announced. She wondered how many more nights would feel like this, how many more rooms would treat her voice as absence rather than effort. And Danielle, weaving through the gala with her tray, felt the tension in her own chest tighten. She wanted to step in, to say something, to break the pattern she saw unfolding before her. But she was only a waitress in a room full of wealth and power, her voice uninvited, her role defined. Still, she kept watching. The room glittered brighter as the night wore on, but for Yumi Takahara, the light only deepened the shadow around her. The silence stretched, invisible but heavy, a wall no one else seemed to notice, except for one pair of eyes that refused to look away. The evening pressed on, but with every passing moment, the air around Yumi grew colder. The chandeliers still gleamed, the laughter still rippled across the tables, yet beneath the surface another current moved, quieter, sharper, and far less forgiving. It was in the half-whispered remarks, the sidelong glances, the tones dipped in sugar but laced with scorn. Yumi could not catch every word, but she caught enough to understand. "Why even come if she can't talk?" a man muttered just behind her shoulder, his voice dripping with false pity. His companion chuckled softly, responding in a hushed tone. "Perhaps she just wants to be seen, not heard." The words struck Yumi like tiny stones, leaving no mark on the surface but creating ripples deep within. She lowered her eyes, her smile still fixed, though it had grown more fragile, like porcelain held too tightly. Another woman leaned across the table, lowering her voice as though sharing a secret. Such wealth, such elegance. And yet, she let the unfinished thought hang, her meaning sharpened by the tilt of her brows. The others at the table laughed politely, not cruel enough to say more, not kind enough to stop. Yumi's silence deepened, not by choice, but by necessity. Each fragment of judgment piled against her, and she knew no English phrase she could summon would be enough to clear it away. Danielle watched as she moved from table to table, her tray balanced carefully in her hands. The remarks weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. She saw it in the small shifts of body language, the dismissive tilt of a chin, the quick narrowing of eyes before laughter resumed, the way conversations adjusted themselves to close. Yumi out. To everyone else, she was a guest sitting quietly in her seat. To Danielle, she was a stone dropped in the center of a river, with conversation rushing around her, flowing effortlessly but never touching her. She was part of the scene, yet untouched by its warmth. The waitress felt an ache rise in her chest as she recognized the pattern. She had known it before, in classrooms where her voice went unheard, in jobs where her effort was invisible, in rooms where people decided her worth before she spoke. The sting of being overlooked was not foreign to her, and now she was watching it unfold again, painted across Yumi's calm, unreadable face. The night reached its cruelest turn when a guest, his cheeks flushed with too much wine, stumbled slightly. As he leaned toward Yumi, his laughter came thick and heavy, spilling over his words. "Money talks," he slurred, raising his glass high. "Even if you don't." The table erupted with uneasy chuckles, the kind meant to smooth over discomfort, but the words hung in the air long after the laughter faded. In that instant, Yumi's identity was stripped to nothing more than her fortune, her silence reduced to a punchline. She did not flinch. She did not let her expression crack. Instead, she remained still, her eyes soft, her hands folded neatly in her lap. But inside, the wall grew higher. Each remark added another brick, sealing her further away from the warmth of the room. To them, she was not a woman who had built empires with resilience. She was not someone who had crossed oceans to be here. She was only the quiet millionaire who could not join their games of wit. Danielle's heart tightened as she stood nearby, tray heavy in her hands. She wanted to set it down, to step forward, to cut through the air with words that would shatter, the cruelty disguised as charm. But she knew her place. She was staff, hired to serve, expected to move unnoticed between the tables, her voice silent unless offering wine or water. To speak up would mean stepping beyond her role, drawing attention, not just to Yumi, but to herself. And yet she couldn't look away. She felt a storm building inside her, one part outrage and another part sorrow. Every fiber of her being told her to stay professional, to let it pass, to remind herself it wasn't her fight. But then she looked again at Yumi, so still, so silent, her elegance masking the ache beneath, and Danielle wondered how long one person could sit in a room full of people and remain unseen. The music played on, laughter filled the air and glasses clinked cheerfully, but between Yumi's silence and Danielle's unrest, another story was unfolding. A story of walls being built higher and higher, and of one woman wrestling with the question of whether she had the courage to break through them. The music drifted softly in the background, the clink of glasses ringing like tiny bells. But at Yumi's table, the silence grew heavier. Danielle approached quietly, her tray balanced with practiced grace, her eyes lingering for a moment on the woman who had endured the night with such quiet dignity. She set a porcelain cup of coffee before Yumi, the steam curling upward like a ribbon of warmth. And then, with a steady breath, she did something no one in that room expected. In clear, fluent Japanese, Danielle asked gently, "Would you like sugar with your coffee?" For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Yumi's head lifted sharply, her dark eyes widening, the practiced mask of composure slipping away. She blinked once, twice, as if to make sure she had heard correctly. The words, so familiar and intimate, pierced the wall around her like sunlight streaming through cracks in stone. She opened her mouth, but no sound came at first, only stunned silence. And then, after a long pause, the most unexpected sound filled the air. Yumi laughed. It was not a forced, polite chuckle like the ones she had offered all evening. It was soft at first, then richer, a sound unguarded and alive. The table froze mid-conversation. Glasses hung in the air. Forks paused inches from lips. Guests stared, confusion flickering across their faces. Something had shifted, though none of them yet understood what. Danielle stood still, her heart racing, but she did not back down. She continued in Japanese, her voice calm but warm, asking if Yumi was enjoying the evening. Yumi leaned forward, her eyes glistening with something close to relief, and answered in her own tongue. The words spilled out, hesitant at first, then freer, like a river that had been dammed too long. She told Danielle she felt invisible, that every word of English she tried to summon dissolved on her tongue, that her silence was mistaken for arrogance. Danielle nodded, her own voice steady as she admitted, still in Japanese, that she had noticed, that she too had once felt what it was like to be unseen in a crowded room. The connection was instant. Two lives touching across cultures and roles, one through confession and the other through recognition. Around them, the other guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Some leaned closer, curious, trying to understand what was being said. Others looked away, unsettled, their smiles faltering as they realized they were no longer in control of the conversation. Whispers began to ripple again, but this time the focus was not on Yumi's silence, it was on her laughter, her words, and the young waitress who had given her the courage to release them. Finally, Danielle straightened and turned to the table. In English, she spoke clearly. She said she feels unseen. The words dropped like stones into the still water of the room. The laughter that had been bubbling moments earlier fell away. Forks rested against plates. Eyes shifted toward Yumi, really looking at her for the first time that night. The power dynamic flipped in that instant. The millionaire who had been rendered voiceless by her language was suddenly heard through the voice of someone they had overlooked entirely, a waitress. And through that bridge, Yumi's truth began to flow. As Danielle translated, Yumi shared fragments of her story in Japanese. She spoke of building her company from nothing, of sleepless nights spent working when others doubted her, of the quiet pride she carried in her success. She confessed that wealth had never been her goal. It had only been a byproduct of discipline and sacrifice. What she had longed for, here at this gala, was not admiration for her fortune, but connection with people who cared about the cause they were supporting. Instead, she had been reduced to a silent figurehead, her presence mistaken for coldness. Her voice, carried through Danielle, held no anger, only honesty, threaded with the ache of being misunderstood. And for the first time that evening, the guests could not look away. They leaned in, not out of pity, but out of an awakening curiosity. The woman they had dismissed as distant and aloof was suddenly human, her vulnerability laid bare not in broken English, but in the fullness of her own language. Danielle felt the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. She was no longer just serving coffee or clearing plates. She was carrying the words of someone who had been silenced, lifting them into a room that finally seemed willing to listen. And as she translated, she saw the change in Yumi's face. The tightness in her jaw eased. The tension in her shoulders softened. For the first time that night, she was not just sitting at the table, she was part of it. The gala had not changed. The chandeliers still glowed, the music still floated softly, the wine still sparkled in crystal glasses. But beneath the glitter, something deeper had shifted. A bridge had been built where only a wall had stood before, and on that bridge, one woman who had felt invisible now found herself seen, her laughter lingering like a melody the room would not soon forget. The room that had once drowned in laughter now sat in a hush, but it was no longer the silence of mockery, no longer the void that had pressed against Yumi all night. This was a silence of weight, of realization, of eyes finally beginning to see what they had missed. Guests leaned back in their chairs, some with their hands folded tightly, others fidgeting with the stems of their glasses, each of them suddenly aware of the quiet harm their neglect had caused. The glittering masks of charm had slipped, and in their place stood humility, raw and uncomfortable, but necessary. Yumi's voice continued in her native tongue, soft yet steady, her words flowing with a strength that could only come from truth. Danielle listened intently, catching every syllable, then lifted her head to translate. "She says," Danielle began, her own voice carrying across the table, "that she gives to this charity because she remembers what it was like to be a child who could not dream big." The words dropped heavy into the room, heavier than the wine, heavier than the laughter that had once filled it. "She said," Danielle continued, her throat tightening, "that she grew up with nothing, that she believed her life would never rise beyond the walls of her small town in Japan, and she said that if someone had not reached out to her, if someone had not believed she was worth investing in, she would not be sitting here tonight." The silence that followed was different now. It was not the silence of dismissal, but of reflection. A stillness that asked each person at that table to confront themselves, to consider how easily they had looked past her, how quickly they had mistaken silence for emptiness. For the first time, they were not laughing, not whispering, not judging. They were listening, truly listening. Across the table, one woman lowered her eyes, her earlier smirk gone, her fingers twisting the edge of her napkin. Another man, the same who had scoffed that money spoke louder than words, set down his glass and cleared his throat, though no words came. The cruelty of moments past could not be erased, but their gestures now were softer, an unspoken apology, an acknowledgement of shame. Danielle kept translating, her voice steady, though her heart ached with the weight of what she carried. Yumi spoke of how she wanted children in Cleveland, children she had never met, children who lived in neighborhoods she would never walk, to have the chance to dream bigger than she once could. Her donations, she said, were not about recognition or status, but about hope. Dreams, Danielle translated softly, are a language we can all understand. The words settled into the air like a final note from the jazz band, lingering long after they were spoken. And then something shifted once more. Yumi turned, her gaze resting not on the guests who had ignored her, but on the young waitress, who had seen her. Slowly, with a grace that silenced the rest of the room, she reached out and took Danielle's hand. Her touch was light but certain, her eyes warm with gratitude. In Japanese, she spoke 3 simple words, and Danielle, her voice thick with emotion, translated them aloud. She called me her bridge. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. In a room divided by walls of language, wealth, and assumption, a bridge had been built, one made not of marble or gold, but of empathy and the courage to listen. Yumi's story had crossed that bridge, and because of it, every person at that table would leave with a piece of her truth etched into their memory. The night slowly returned to its rhythm. Glasses clinked again, though the sound carried less bravado. Conversations resumed, but they were gentler, softer, touched with a newfound awareness. And while apologies were not spoken outright, they were there in the way eyes met hers with sincerity, in the way postures shifted from arrogance to respect. Subtle, yes, but unmistakable. As the gala drew to a close, Yumi remained seated, her hand still lightly holding Danielle's. For the first time that evening, she was not alone. She had been heard, she had been seen, and she had been given a voice, not by wealth, not by power, but by a single act of empathy. And so the story of that night does not end with the chandeliers dimming or the music fading. It ends with a question that lingers long after. In a world where walls of misunderstanding rise so easily, will we choose to walk past them? Or will we be the bridge that brings someone across? Because sometimes all it takes is one voice, one act of courage to remind us that no one deserves to be invisible. And perhaps the greatest wealth any of us can offer is not measured in dollars, but in the simple gift of seeing another human being.